So we're going to kick off with someone who's just a fantastic person to kick this off with. Michael Cembalest has been at J.P. Morgan for over 35 years. If you've seen some of his writings, they're overwhelming, they're very good, and they also point to so many factors that are involved in all this. He puts out an annual letter in the spring, which captures many of the potential technologies, all the various issues. It's extremely good. Shane mentioned my background with companies, and I would say when it comes to a boardroom and you think about who would you like to have come speak, Michael Cembalest is at the top of the list. He's also, at present, he's the chairman of Market and Investment Strategy. And that's the other big issue I would ask you to have in your mind as we go through today, which is resources are limited, capital is limited. You can't just spend unlimited buckets of money despite what some people might think. And so you have to make choices given what you're trying to achieve. And that last part is the hardest part of the whole equation. How should we be spending capital to achieve these goals that we're all talking about as a society and as a planet? So I'm going to get out of the way. Michael's got some great slides to go through, and then we'll have a conversation. If I could get a round of applause for Michael Cembalest.
So I give a lot of energy talks and to boards and other groups. So I brought some of the materials I thought were interesting. I started this journey 13, 14 years ago. I didn't know that much about the energy ecosystem, and our clients knew even less. And we've got some pretty smart clients in the pharmaceutical industry and real estate, logistics. But when they talked about energy, I started to get a headache because none of it made any sense. So I knew that I would need a mentor to go through this. And if any of you are familiar with Vaclav Smil, he's been the technical advisor to me on this energy journey over the last 10 to 15 years. And he's a brilliant guy, and he's written a lot of books. And he tells it like it is, and he's very cranky, which fits perfectly with my personality. So let's see if this works and get started here. So I always start with this page because I want people to understand where we're coming from on this decarbonization journey and how fast it can happen. The chart starts at a point where there was some pre-existing hydropower that went back years ago, and this chart shows the percentage of overall primary energy that comes from fossil fuels. And then we had an era in the 70s where we had nuclear build-out, and then we have the solar and wind build-out that's taking place more recently. But the slope of this thing is not 5% a year, it's closer to 1% a year, and it takes time. And so whenever people say, well, why is J.P. Morgan as a bank still lending to the oil and gas business? My counter question would be, you mean we're the largest bank in the United States and we're not supposed to lend to the industry that accounts for 80% of primary energy production? That there's no historical precedent for any bank in any country that would ever do that to any sector that was that large a percentage of economic output. So we're also financing an enormous amount of renewable activity and all of the above approach that was mentioned earlier, but you kind of have to understand where we're here. And if we stop lending to oil and gas, it doesn't make this line go faster, right? People won't consume less oil and gas just because we wouldn't fund it. All that would happen would be that Warren Buffett, who's a big energy investor, and the GIC would come in and do it at a higher premium. So here's, I think, a really important way to conceptualize the energy transition. Because there's three of them going on. One of them's moving rapidly, the other two are not. So the part of the energy transition that everybody understands pretty well is that green line, which is the renewable share of electricity generation. That's going up, and I think with the energy bill, that might even accelerate a bit. We'll talk about reasons why it might not, but that's on a pretty decent clip, and there aren't too many national security issues associated with wind and solar per se. And the problem is we only use electricity for around 20 to 25% of overall energy consumption, right? I mean, whenever I hear a college university celebrate the fact that they're kind of a green campus, I'm like, okay, where'd the food and the buildings come from? How did people get to and from campus, right? You're celebrating the fact that the HVAC systems are driven by wind, solar, and biomass. That's great, but that's not the achievement you think it is. So only about 20 to 25% of energy consumption is through electricity. So, and that's a much harder journey. And as you can see in the United States, the electricity share of overall energy consumption is kind of flat. So until you start getting basically home heating and transportation and industrial energy consumption electrified, the benefits of wind and solar power are going to be confined to pushing coal, gas, and probably decommissioned nuclear out of the grid. And then there's biofuels. Biofuels are a really tough go, except in places like Brazil and Indonesia, where they've got sugarcane that has 8 times the energy content of corn ethanol. So the good news on EVs, none of us know how fast the transition is going to go. There are first mover people, but people have figured out that many of the first EV buyers tended to drive more energy efficient cars in the first place, so you're not getting quite the emissions benefit that you thought you'd get. The EV transition will be ongoing, right? So the good news is I don't think it's going to be catastrophic for the grid per se, because as you can see here, you'd need another 5 or 8% of electricity generation to accommodate 50% penetration of the fleet, not just 50% penetration in terms of sales, to get you that additional cars on the road. There's also decarbonization of winter heating. And if you look at the chart on the left, for the first time, heat pumps are overtaking gas furnaces. Essentially, a heat pump is an air conditioner that runs in reverse and is engineered through its coefficient of performance, which you should look up if you don't understand what that means, to understand how heat pumps work, are much more energy efficient than regular electric resistance heating. And assuming that the grid you're powering them from doesn't have too much coal on it, it ends up being a net reduction in energy consumption and emissions. And so the heat pump revolution is now starting. The challenge is the infrastructure that you need to make all of this electrification work. And I think this part is really poorly understood. In a lot of communities around Texas and New York and California, everywhere else, you've got a bunch of households, each of which are supported by a local transformer, that assuming that each household's going to draw 2 kilowatts of power. All of a sudden, you give that guy a heat pump to replace his gas furnace and an EV level 2 charger, and each individual household could dramatically increase the amount of power that they're drawing. So all that localized infrastructure is going to have to get upgraded and replaced. And then the other thing about the heat pumps is, and everybody in Texas understands this, you can electrify something, but on a very cold day, electricity consumption goes up, and heat pump performance tends to degrade in very cold temperatures. So you have a double whammy spike in electricity. If there are too many people or office buildings that have put in heat pumps for winter heating, a lot of both the generation and the transmission will have to get upgraded. So I think that this is the important part to understand about the energy transition, is that we have 100 years of existing infrastructure that was built based on the assumption that you're not going to be electrifying transportation or winter heating, and now we are. And so there's a lot of work and a lot of money that has to get spent on this. And I think it's also important to understand this is what US energy consumption looks like. And so you've got 4 main categories: industrial, transport, and then residential, commercial buildings. The light blue bars on the bottom are what come from electricity. And so today, as we mentioned earlier, all the new wind and solar is greenifying those light blue bars. That's about it. And direct fossil fuels, as you can see, are used heavily in the other 4 sectors. And so we've talked about transport, right? EVs, eventually Class 8, long-haul trucks. We'll see who wins the battle between hydrogen and electric batteries. Right now, it's like watching 2 drunk guys fall down a hill because there's not a lot of penetration of either one of them. And then we've talked about the heat pumps for residential commercial heating, which is advancing more quickly. The industrial sector, steel, plastic, cement, ammonia, fertilizer, glass, rubber, all the stuff you see on the right, that's the industrial energy consumption. That's really hard to decarbonize. And I've probably read more articles over the last 10 years celebrating some new innovation that's going to radically change this, and nothing has happened at all. So I'm in favor of JP Morgan lending to companies, say they can change this, but as it relates to public policy and what you do about oil and gas lending and oil and gas policies and pipeline construction, you have to be realistic here. In my experience for over 35 years, anytime there's a line that's the same for as long as I've been at JP Morgan or longer, it's going to be hard to move it. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it means you have some pretty serious thermodynamic challenges staring you in the face. And your engineering professors can explain this better than I can. The problem with electrifying process heat in industrial energy consumption is that you lose the waste heat that was being used in the first place to help power the combustion itself. Electricity also costs a lot more per megajoule than natural gas does, which is another reason why it's hard to electrify. So electrification of industrial energy consumption is hard work, and there's some low-hanging fruit, but they tend to be the smaller categories of consumption. All right. So we now have this Manhattan Project for wind and solar, which I think is a fair way to describe the ambitions of the energy bill. I think the right way to look at power generation is to look at new capacity additions in the United States per capita per year. And so here you can see that we had a spike in the late 1980s, and then you had the natural gas spike in the early 2000s, and now we're having the wind and solar spike. The ambition of the energy bill is to get this line up to that, somewhere between that dotted line range, and sustain it there for 10 to 15 years. That's a big ask. Theoretically, you could do it, and I think the country certainly has the production capacity to build it. I don't think the United States has the politics, the temperament, or the ability to connect it. So it's one thing to build generation, it's another thing to connect it to the grid. So this is from the International Energy Agency for the United States, and this is their projections for 2030. So let's take the ones on the left as an example. By 2030, there's current stuff in place that's going to have to get replaced. Only the orange bar that's current that's going to have to get replaced to 2050 that you can give yourself a little bit of a breather on. The rest of it's going to have to be new. And it's really hard to build transmission. When you travel across the United States and you do work and you use your cell phone and you do stuff like that, you're benefiting from the fact that there used to be federal eminent domain for the interstate highway system, interstate rail, federal and military aviation, fiber optic networks, a whole bunch of stuff. There is no federal eminent domain, for those of you that looked at this at transmission, why it's so hard to build it. And if anything, the facts on the ground is that the grid is expanding more slowly rather than accelerating. This is going in the opposite direction of which it's supposed to go. And living in the Northeast, you can't get anything done, right? We kicked out Amazon. You think we're going to allow people to build power lines and pipelines? No way. So this is looking at the major ISOs, at the amount of gigawatt miles, which is the unit that you have to think about here because it's adjusted for voltage, and it's been going down, not up. And so, this is this is a reflection of the legal issues, the regulatory issues. We have a client that owns wind farms in Wyoming. And they've been working on a project called the Trans-West Express to bring that wind power to the California border, because California loves green power. So next year, they're going to put a shovel in the ground to start the project. It's the 18th year of the project, and 80% of the Trans-West Express is on public lands. So it's taken them 18 years to navigate 20% of that journey, and probably a couple $100 million. And that's been similar to other projects. At least they're being able to build it. The Northwest Express that was supposed to be used to bring Canadian hydropower to Massachusetts got scrapped because their friends in Maine and New Hampshire refused to allow the construction of a high voltage direct current line to traverse their states to go to Massachusetts. So now Massachusetts thinks that they're going to build offshore wind and connect it to the pipe cleaner grid in Cape Cod. Good luck with that. So, all right, let's talk about, you okay over there? Keep going? All right. So, nuclear power. On paper, there's no better source of energy. On paper, but it's a small piece of paper. Because once you start getting to the other pieces of paper, it gets a lot more complicated. And again, you can consult your nuclear power engineering professors as to why, but one big issue is that at some point those nuclear rods become unstable and have to be removed from the core, but they're still radioactive and there's no real permanent storage solution. Finland is building the first one like 7 kilometers down in the North Sea. They have the topography to try to do that. The rest of the world that has nuclear power is storing them in temporary form in dry casks, or in the case of Japan, swimming pools. And that's not a great, those aren't great long-term solutions for nuclear power. The other issue is cost. There were 2 plants just completed in Georgia, wildly expensive, wildly over budget, wildly late. Same things happening in Europe. And everybody always argues, well, if we really got the nuclear industry cranked up and we could benefit from economies of scale, we benefit from economies of scale in EV batteries because we're producing millions of them. We're never going to even produce 200 nuclear power plants. We're lucky we'll be able to build 30, in which case each one is going to be like a snowflake. And so I'm dubious of the ability to bring those costs down because of the redundancies required to get these things built. SMRs, I was baffled from the beginning about small modular reactors. In every part of a capital-intensive business, if you have certain sunk costs, the bigger the projects are, the more efficient they are, and yet somehow the advocates of small modular reactors say, let's take a capital-intensive project like nuclear, make it smaller, and we'll make it more efficient. Let's see, right? The budgets have already increased by a factor of 4 for those new-scale Idaho plants since they were conceptualized, and everything else is still on paper. So I'm a big supporter of whatever public policy can be done to try to help this, but the facts on the ground are very, very challenging. So I wanted to make sure that people are able to understand when people are misrepresenting information and either deliberately or because they don't even understand it. And levelized cost of energy is a real problem because the politicians and the general public will read from the EIA or from Lazard that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of power, and basically that's true if you live like in a world that's defined by a cocktail napkin. And this chart from ERCOT is a good indication of what I mean by that. These are the capacity factors for Texas wind from last year on an hourly basis. Somebody doing an LCOE calculation, which is levelized cost of energy, would simply say, well, the average wind capacity factors are 32%. And they would compute it the same way if it was a flat line at 32%, or if it varied like this from 5 to 70 and averaged at 32%. But obviously the backup thermal power that you need to complement this system is very different if the capacity factor actually averaged 32% for that whole period, or if it varied like it actually did. And so levelized cost of energy is basically junk science, masquerading as somebody doing math. And the ISOs understand this, the utilities understand this. They have a whole new set of calculations, one of which I'll show you, that are meant to incorporate the fact that wind and solar power are variable and intermittent. And the second bullet point there basically explains the issue, right? LCOE does not include the cost of backup power, utility scale storage, and regional transmission expansion that's required to accompany these high renewable grids. I mean, it's kind of like, you go to dinner and they hand you the bill for the appetizer, and then they hand you the bill for the rest of it on your way to the car. I don't think you'd like that very much. So these are called capacity credits, and this is a good way to understand it. Each one of the ISOs is required to disclose this, which is every time we build a megawatt of wind and solar power, how much natural gas backup thermal capacity can we unplug, right? And a few years ago, there was less understanding about this. People thought these numbers would be 50 to 70 to 80%. They're not. New York says it's 30. I think they're computing it wrong. The other numbers are closer to 10 to 15%. And of course they are, right? You need reserve margins and redundancy, and you need to deal with times when there's no wind and solar. So these are the capacity credits, which are a reflection of the fact that this renewable journey is going to cost money, right? Because we're going to have to maintain a lot of thermal capacity in a high renewable world. We may not use it a lot, and our emissions may drop, but your energy bill is going to have to reflect the cost of building new generation capacity for wind and solar and building and maintaining backup thermal capacity, unless you want rolling blackouts and demand side management and other things like that, which are more uncertain. So I don't have a problem with this journey. It's going to be expensive, and it's something that is, I think, necessary when you think about the long-term consequences of the climate and the planet, but we should be under no illusion of what this is going to be about. And you can look at the Energiewende transition in Germany. They've cut their emissions by a third over the last 15 years. Their installed electricity power generation capacity has doubled. They've basically had to double installed capacity in order to cut their emissions by a third. And their electricity prices for industrial and households are off the charts. So Germany as a society has collectively decided that they are willing to pay that price. But that's the epiphany that you have to have about a high renewable penetration grid that needs a lot of backup capacity. Just a few comments on hydrogen. People talk about the hydrogen economy as if it's like a unicorn fairy type thing in the future. There already is a hydrogen economy. The primary uses are in oil refining for desulfurization of diesel and for ammonia used for fertilizer. It's just that it's produced via natural gas and primarily, and some oil and coal and steam methane reformation. So we already have a hydrogen economy. It's the rest of the stuff that, so there's a $3 a kilogram subsidy in the energy bill to produce green hydrogen. And there are a number of different ways of potentially doing that. If that green hydrogen is going to be used to offset the brown hydrogen in this chart, I'm a huge fan, right? Because essentially you're decarbonizing hydrogen production. What you should be aware of, though, is that hydrogen via electrolysis is an electricity hog, right? And like one of those big Texas hogs, not like a little cute New York hog. So this chart shows if we were to replace brown hydrogen production in the United States, I think it's 10 million tons a year, with green hydrogen, if you did it with wind and solar, it would take all of the wind and solar currently installed in order to do it, and around 80% of all the installed nuclear power plants in the United States, right? And so I could have told you that it's 48 to 52 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen, but that wouldn't have meant anything to you because it didn't mean anything to me. So what I did was I said, all right, let me take that underlying unit and see what it would take to do this. And so this is, I think, a better way of understanding just how electricity-intensive electrolysis is as an option. Now, there's other ways of doing it. Let's see if they're scalable. And this is the real issue. Once you get beyond replacing existing brown hydrogen with green hydrogen, and you have all these other use cases, my paper on this is entitled Hydrogen, because I don't get it. Because for every single one of these use cases, I can envision and contemplate a better idea. And guess what? So can everybody else. Over the last year, lots of hydrogen projects in the United States and in Europe related to buses, trains, trucks, and fertilizer were scrapped because people started to get closer to the real world costs of that hydrogen production. Every time hydrogen is converted into ammonia and then back into so that you can transport it, and then it's transformed back into hydrogen so you can run it through a fuel cell, and then you're generating and you're running electric motor, there's an energy penalty on all those transitions. If you start out with a kilowatt hour of wind and solar power, 23% of it is left by the time you are powering a fuel cell powered vehicle. And the comparable number for regular lithium ion battery is somewhere between 65 and 70%. It's really hard to make that work, and I don't think there's any subsidy that's going to be enough to do that. Carbon sequestration, the highest ratio in the history of science is the ratio of academic papers written on carbon sequestration divided by actual carbon sequestration. I've actually done the math on that. It's called the CCS ratio. And it's like you can't even put it in a spreadsheet. It's got too many digits. So it's not that it's hard to do, right? And I think a lot of studies have been done that shows that there's enough caverns to absorb it and that leakage risks are low and things like that. But it's thermodynamically hard to do. Why is that? The chart on the left shows where the big GHG emissions are coming from in the industrial sector in the United States. The two big ones are coal and natural gas fired power plants, okay? So put that in one side of your brain. Now look at the chart on the right. What's the CO2 concentration in flue gas streams? Well, they're very high in certain ammonia processing and ethanol plants, but they're 10 to 15% in kind of a standard coal and natural gas plant. So that is thermodynamically challenging because your biggest sources of CO2 emissions are diffuse. And that's part of the reason that it takes a lot of power. Now, there's a lot of investment and innovation taking place. You'll probably hear about some of that today. And let's see how it goes, right? And I'm always open to look and see confirmed, Argonne Lab or somebody takes a look at something and says, yes, this works. I think there are areas here where industrial heat pumps or different absorbers could maybe improve the processing here. But don't underestimate what you're up against. Oh, and by the way, you see how a natural gas-fired power plant, the concentration of the flue gas is around 10% or so. What's the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere? Somebody in this room has to know, or else, sorry? It's 0.04%. So when anybody talks about the miracles of direct air carbon capture, get a drink. So the other thing to remember is a lot of what we're talking about here is what's going on in the US and Europe. But over the last 25 years, part of this is reversing now, but over the last 25 years, there's been a massive exodus of energy-intensive manufacturing from the developed world to the developing world, and you can see it here with overall manufacturing and ammonia, steel, cement, and plastics and things like that. So part of what's happening in Europe is the shedding of energy-intensive activities are flattering their emissions profile because it looks like they are achieving something when all they're doing is abdicating, high-paying jobs and exporting those activities to places in Vietnam and the Philippines. So the deindustrialization of the West is also part of this story, and we should not lose sight of that. And just two more slides. I've spent a lot of time with Jamie on energy, more time with him on energy than any other topic I spent time with him on. And this is the chart that I have him, planted in his brain, which is as we go through this journey, you have to keep national security and energy independence in mind. And when I was a kid, I remember I was 8 years old and we had gas lines and people were lined up for blocks to fill up their cars. And Nixon talked about the importance of energy independence. And 50, 60 years later, we finally have it. Manchin tried to make sure in the energy bill with certain domestic content requirements that we don't lose that energy security as we go down this renewable journey. And he's been thwarted by Schumer and a lot of the people in the Treasury that are interpreting the rules of that bill. But as far as our firm goes, we understand that there's a mission here that affordable energy is important and national security is important, and emissions are important, and you somehow have to maintain an eye on all of those things at the same time. I would not have wanted to be in Europe over the last couple of years dealing with their energy reliance issues, and here you can see that they're still pretty high in spite of all the steps they've taken. And the US is now energy independent for really the first time in the last 50, 60 years. I wanted to show one more thing. I thought you guys would like this. We have a lot of clients that complain about the Electoral College. And I like to torment them whenever I can. And because it's not going away. There's not enough constitutional support to do that. So I said, okay, you don't like the way it works now. I have a new idea. Let's have the Electoral College structured based on the amount of food, energy, and mining that takes place. Because that stuff's, hard to import. It's not like computers and clothing. You can't import it from someplace else. And it's heavily reliant on domestic production. Let's change the amount of seats that each state gets based on their contribution to food, energy, and mining. And this is a revised map of the United States. So the states have all shifted around a bit. New York kind of disappears. And look at the size of North Dakota and Iowa and places like that, and Pennsylvania. So anyway, this is just for fun, but let's proceed with the rest of the discussion.
So thanks so much, Michael. We knew that would be fun. I had seen this slide, and it's a good slide for Texans to start the morning.
Well, that's why I wouldn't have brought it if I was in California.
We want to see the California slide, Michael. We know you have it. Well, one question for you, because you heard in the lead-in that here at KBH, the engineering school is now part of the discussion and has formally joined. And it seems like so much of what's been going on in this debate around the energy transition is we've had the politicians, the policymakers, a lot of people, and now we're bringing the engineers in. How do you, as you watch this discussion, how do you think we get more engineering-based, practical-based discussion into the broader conversation?
Good luck with that.
Okay. It is very complicated
look,
stuff.
I mean, House members have to run every 2 years. And after the energy that you spend on that, the idea that you're going to have the patience to sit down and walk through a deck like this, it's going to be difficult. It's a big ask. It starts at the top, though, right? And so, and Elaine and I were talking about this yesterday. Some cabinet positions are more important than others. And so I understand that there's requirements for political patronage, and sometimes you have to reward certain people with ambassadorships and things like that, that first have to look, okay, where's that country? I get it. But when it comes to positions like the Secretary of Energy, it starts at the top, and you need to put somebody in that job that understands something about energy and has a background in science, math, engineering, something energy related. And the last few presidents have done a poor job on that. Ernie Moniz was the last energy secretary that I remember that was qualified to have the job. And so it's a bad signal when you put somebody in that seat that doesn't know anything about the subject.
So how do you, maybe tell us a little bit, because I mentioned it in my introduction, your spring letter is phenomenal in its scope. Your presentation today, there's so many things that you're watching and thinking about. You mentioned Václav Smil. How does your team keep up with all this? How do you analyze it? How do you update it? There's so much happening in the world. Tell us about the team.
Well, it's me, Zach, about it. No, I have a team of 3 analysts. But like once you do this, the paper itself is very empirically based. And so every year we're going to be updating and refreshing the charts to get a sense for whether certain things are changing or not. And I have some connections in the energy community to find out like what's changing. But every year, 90% of the stuff on the radar remains on the radar. And only 10% of it starts to kind of migrate into, wow, this is making a broad, impactful change. The technology improvements in heat pumps available for residential, in office buildings, to me, the biggest example of a positive, broadly impactful and scalable technological change in the energy transition of the last 5 years.
So maybe give us a feel. You do talk to investors, governments, companies, companies in energy, companies outside of energy. When you go through your presentation, what are the things that people say, oh, wow, what's the most surprising, or what is the most controversial, or where do you end up spending the most time trying to say, wait a minute, let me help you, what's the key piece of this?
I mean, it depends who you're talking to. The reception to this information is quite different depending on the state that you present it in. And normally I refuse to talk to college students, just because in a lot of parts of the country, there's no requirements for core curricula, and it's very hard to go through this with somebody that's never had math, engineering, science, anything like that. And it doesn't mean they're wrong, and I learn a lot of interesting things from young people. It's just a constructive dialogue about this requires at least some kind of basic understanding of where we're starting from and the history of all this stuff. The transmission one is the most difficult part, because not the only solution, but the most straightforward path to decarbonization is electrification, because once you can electrify it, you can use a combination of wind, solar, hydro, nuclear to then decarbonize it. But electrification requires enormous amounts of transmission investment, and as we discussed, a lot of local investment in transformers and other distribution equipment. And that's expensive, and somebody has to pay for it. The notion that the energy bill subsidies are going to be financed by 800 new IRS agents, this is what the CBO had scored, I can't wait to do the math 5 years later and look back and see how that turned out. Because maybe they'll get 20% of what they were budgeting.
I would totally.
That's right. And on the transmission issue, it's very unpopular. Texas has had a lot of wind projects that were designed to go to other states canceled by neighboring states who didn't want the power lines. And power lines are unpopular. Even when developers offer to bury them at 3 to 4 times the cost, they're very expensive, but people still say they don't want them. And without eminent domain on that issue, I think the transition's going to go much more slowly, and the U.S. needs to double down on its natural gas development and pipelines, because otherwise, where's the energy going to come from?
So I was going to say, I totally agree the way that the transmission piece sticks out, and then more broadly, whether you're talking about nuclear or whether you're talking about moving industry to the developing world, the other piece that sticks out is just how hard it is to do stuff.
So one of the principles behind the semiconductor bill, the energy bill, infrastructure bill, is repatriating a lot of things that we used to do. And I'm in favor of that. I'm a huge fan of there's going to be an electric vehicle battery assembly plant belt stretching all the way from Georgia through Michigan, going through some of the most disadvantaged communities in the United States that were left in the dust when the U.S. let China into the World Trade Organization. I think that's a fantastic idea. Those communities need desperate revitalization. A guy at MIT has showed on a census tract basis, the more competition a census tract had with China, the higher their opioid addiction rates were. So I think it's fantastic that battery belt is being built where it's going to be built. I think it's great that we're trying to repatriate what we used to do in terms of semiconductor production. It's going to be expensive, right? TSMC is building a semiconductor facility in Arizona. It's going to cost a lot more than it does in Taiwan, but I think it's worth paying for to have some kind of domestic security on semiconductors. But these and the battery assembly plants and semiconductor facilities not hard to permit. Lithium mining and processing facilities, I could easily see that being a 10 to 15-year permitting process. So parts of the supply chain that are currently reliant on China are going to be more difficult to repatriate than others.
So your comments on when you do have a math, science, engineering, that background is extremely useful to understanding what's happening here. The other one you mentioned Richard Nixon and the 70s.
Right.
So
I don't bring up Nixon a lot.
No, it was fine. We don't talk about Nixon enough. But for those people who do remember the 70s, that does inform, don't you think, your view of inflation, national security, and you know that so much of the 70s had to do with energy dependence. Do you think people who remember the 70s are advantaged when they see this problem?
Yeah, but we're old, right? And so, you have to have lived through it in order to have it influence the way that you think. But if you can't conceptualize the 70s because you didn't live through it, think about the fact that from 2010 to 2021, everyone told you that inflation was dead. The Fed was publishing papers on why the Phillips curve was dead, and then inflation was dead. And all of a sudden, the Fed had to raise interest rates by 500 basis points in the fastest hiking cycle in history because inflation wasn't dead. Right? That's how quickly things can change if you mismanage the public policy issues. So, what happened in the 1970s followed a period of very low inflation in the late 60s, but then you had Vietnam War spending. Right now the fiscal deficit in the United States is huge and not that different than what it was during the financial crisis, and we're not even in a recession. So we have some of the inflation's been coming down, but the question is, where is it going based on this new industrial policy? We could easily be in a higher inflation world in a few years. It's not terrible to have higher growth, higher inflation, but it's an adjustment.
So I think that's one question. Like you mentioned, the battery factories and reshoring and how that could help a lot of communities in America, but also the inflation, right, is a real problem. Do you view all this as sort of as we're doing it now? Do you view it as fundamentally inflationary, or how do you think about it?
It's inescapably inflationary.
Okay.
I don't know how you avoid that. It's simply the backup thermal capacity required to support intermittent renewables. And fine, suppose you don't want to use backup thermal capacity and you want to use energy storage. Then you not only have to build the energy storage, you have to overbuild the wind and the solar to generate the surplus curtailed energy to put into the storage in the first place. So there's the existing system we had as of 5 years ago was cost minimized, but not emissions minimized. The new system is going to try to get closer to emissions minimization, but you can't do cost minimization at the same time.
So you give discussions like this. You speak in so many places, and you watch attitudes and you hear questions. Do you think like this point about redundancy and having backup and what it's doing to cost and so on and so forth, do you think the world is learning here, or are we just continuing to kind of dig into our own camps about how to do this?
Right. Well, New York is an interesting place because it's full of a lot of people that think they understand things that they don't understand. And so a few years ago, Indian Point is a nuclear power plant that had a huge contribution to electricity generation in the region, in the metro area. There's a natural gas line running underneath Indian Point. So there's been a movement over the last 25 years to decommission Indian Point for no other reason than that. And I'm not going to argue the science there. I agree with the Union of Concerned Scientists that was a problem. So they decommissioned Indian Point. The people that run NYSERDA, which is kind of the equivalent of ERCOT, said, well, not a problem. We'll have wind and solar take up the slack. And New York ranks last in the United States in terms of its wind capacity factors, 23% compared to like high 30s, mid 40s, in Texas up through the Dakotas. And our solar capacity factors are 14%, something like that, half of what you get in Arizona. So I knew that this wasn't going to work. And 95% of the power generation that replaced Indian Point has been natural gas. Of course it was. So as things like that happen, maybe that'll start influencing public policy, but I'd be willing to bet that most New York congressmen and probably the governor don't even know that that's happened, because somebody would have to tell them.
Well, we're going to send them a video of this and see if we can change it. Well, one question, so you mentioned, when you think about the Northeast, and we all understand why it's harder to do things in the Northeast, but the Northeast does sit there right next to the Marcellus.
They do.
So for people,
and electricity prices in New England.
Right.
are the same as they are in Alaska.
So,
And they're sandwiched between the Marcellus and 5 cents a kilowatt hour Canadian hydropower. And they are politically unable to do anything about it. I mean, that it is the most, I don't think I've ever seen anything this dysfunctional ever, because in their own self-interest, they could solve the problem in one of two simple ways. Build a connection to import Canadian hydropower at low cost, or natural gas. And yet, New England and Massachusetts in particular are going to be facing rolling brownouts because they can't add any more generation capacity.
so it kind of raises the question more broadly, like our next discussion is going to be around hydrocarbons, what's going on with oil and gas, and we'll get into a lot of LNG. How do you see, how's the debate going around natural gas? How do you see it? When are we going to kind of embrace it fully, or what's your view there?
One of the challenges with natural gas is part of its emissions advantage versus coal is eroded by methane leakage. And the natural gas industry reports its methane emissions to the EPA. I don't think we should take those numbers super seriously, because there's a lot of aerial drone studies increasingly done all over the country that are doing spot measurements that are much higher than what gets reported to the EPA. And so, now, the good thing is, it's 2023, and the technology that exists today to solve those problems by identifying where those leaks are happening and remediating them in real time can be done. And at least 70% of the natural gas industry is committed to doing it. But that more progress has to be made on that before the industry can really make a compelling case that its emissions benefits versus coal are durable. It's not a popular opinion, and I've been accosted by some natural gas people for that, but those are the facts.
But when you think about it from a market share and acceptability standpoint, shouldn't the natural gas industry be just going full tilt to stop methane? Because if you stop methane...
And they are, right? And the tools are available to do it. There's a whole bunch of new startups, some of which JP Morgan are financing, in order to use various kinds of aerial and localized sensors to depict those things. Once they're located, they're reasonably easy to fix. But there has to be much more, there's a lot more has to be done. And in any industry, it's always 20% of the operators that cause 80% of the problems. And so they may have to continue to kind of tighten the screws on that issue. But I don't think there's any question that the United States is going to need material amounts of natural gas through 2035 or 2040, at least.
So when you were talking a little bit earlier here, you used the expression industrial policy. I think you said that. And so you're a market person. So the other thing that's happened in all this is we have heavy government involvement, steering. What do you make of the level of government involvement in the economy now?
Right.
How does that, when you think about the next 10 years, how do you think that plays out?
Well, the thing about the energy bill that's different than most other historical bills, a lot of big government bills involve government spending. 80% of the energy bill is incentives, not spending. They're just giving out tax incentives, tax abatements, production tax credits, and investment tax credits, green hydrogen tax credits. So they're leaving a certain amount of discretion to the private sector to decide what to do, where to do it, and how to do it. So that's actually a plus, because if I'm a big fan of the Mercatus Center and the work that they do, and if you believe that in the way that the private sector functions, it's better to leave a lot of those decisions with them rather than having kind of state and federal directed projects taking place in certain places and things like that. So I have an open mind about about the potential productivity benefits of having the private sector make those decisions.
So what is interesting about it, though, is when you structure it that way, you don't really know how much you're going to spend, right?
Yeah.
So it's a little concerning.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
The CBO scored the energy bill, and within 2 to 3 weeks, a bunch of analysts, Goldman came out, and I don't know if they're right, but Goldman came out and said, the utilization of these tax credits is going to be at least double what the CBO was anticipating. So even if we assume that all those IRS agents raise the money they're supposed to raise, this still has enormous potential deficit consequences. So this, again, is it's going to be a very expensive transition. And at least in Germany, they're doing it honestly, because all that duplicative capacity is generally passed through not to taxpayers, but to ratepayers through their energy bills, so you can really see the cost. In the United States, electricity prices will no longer reflect the true cost of the energy ecosystem because it's being financed by taxpayers with a widening deficit, and it's going to be much harder for people like me and you to figure out, like, what's the whole cost of this transition, because a bunch of it is just going to be large fiscal deficits monetized by the Federal Reserve.
So that's another question that comes up as you go through all this, and your charts point to increasing costs, some inefficiencies, all these things. Somebody has to pay. And right now, the way we're doing it is sort of disguised because it's on a federal balance sheet, or it's on, it's hidden. Do you think a carbon tax approach or a more direct approach would have yielded better results in that sense?
There's no political support for it. A lot of people kind of spend time, good economists spend time thinking about different ways of structuring carbon taxes and things like that. But I'm an investments person, and there's nothing for me to sink my teeth into, right? The Europeans have carbon taxes, and they also have carbon border adjustment taxes they're about to put in, and they're doing that unilaterally, which is pretty brave because they're going to be doing that when nobody else is doing it. But we don't even have a significant gas tax in the United States, right? Higher gasoline taxes would be a logical next step before you got to actually a carbon tax.
Do you worry about, you reference it, do you worry about deficits, the debt? Like, how are you viewing the fiscal situation in Washington as we pursue all these various things?
Elaine and I have been seeing some of our clients in Dallas and in Austin on this trip, and everyone wants to talk about that. By 2032, 100% of federal government revenue is going to be consumed by mandatory entitlements and interest on the debt, with nothing left for non-defense discretionary spending or defense. Obviously, that's an untenable situation. It's like saying you're going to spend 100% of your income on rent and you just won't eat. So that doesn't work. And at some point before that, there's going to have to be some kind of grand compromise to restructure government spending relative to taxes. My goal is to be retired before that happens.
So maybe just a couple more thoughts. And if you do have a question, something you really want to see addressed, just send it in, using your phone. But you mentioned Jamie Dimon, and Jamie, it's really been so admirable the way he has been willing to take a stand, been willing to speak up. Most of the financial community doesn't do what he's doing or share those opinions, or if they have them, they don't share them. So kudos to the organization, to JP Morgan, but is that going to continue? Is that catching on? Is it hard for him to keep doing? Like, what would you tell us about that environment?
Jamie will keep doing that, from the afterlife. So I'm not worried about his resilience. The resilience of anybody else, look, remember, the financial sector, for a variety of reasons, has been bailed out on a number of occasions by the federal government, which has, I think, reduced the appetite of some of the other CEOs to take a hard stand on certain things. Some of them are also not informed enough on the topic to really kind of say, this is what we're going to do and this is why we're doing it, and I don't care how many protesters show up in our lobby and how many people show up at our shareholder meetings. We think this is the right all of the above strategy for the United States. We're the largest bank, we're going to do it. I don't see that temperament in some of our competitors, and that's a shame.
How has it gone for JP Morgan as an organization? I know that's a tough question, but he has taken a stand. You've endured the protesters. I just am curious how you've weathered that.
I mean, it's fine. I mean, we energy is not the only thing that we get protested about. So the organization has reflexive muscles to deal with the fact that some stakeholders and constituents in the places you operate don't like the way you do business, and sometimes you adjust to that. A lot of times you adjust to that, and sometimes you don't. And again, the very first slide here was, what other sector would account for 80% of output that we would say, nah, we're not going to get involved, right? So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I do think that some of the other CEOs, particularly of the big money managers, the $1 trillion money managers, went too far in the decarbonization camp and have had to double back because they realized that it was untenable. And by the way, there's been some SEC investigations of money management firms who have overstressed the ESG components of some of their investment offerings, where a lot of that was kind of nonsense to begin with.
So I assume you have a lot of meetings with pensions, endowments, big institutional investors, some of them, and you're outspoken and have already referenced it, not funding oil and gas, you just don't see how that helps anybody. But how do those conversations go? Do you think that community is going to come back to classic energy when it comes to investing?
Some of them will, some of them won't, right? I mean, when CalSTRS and CalPERS, no, right? It's just the politics are too difficult. But across the rest of the country, there's plenty of people that are doing this. And look, the problem is every time a large U.S. institutional ERISA plan drops out of funding oil and gas, as I mentioned, oil and gas consumption doesn't drop. Abu Dhabi, the GIC, Mubadala, and somebody like that is just going to step in and do it instead and charge a higher premium. That's been my experience.
So can we ask you, as you look at this space, in the level-headed way that you've approached it, and then someone says, okay, so what should I invest in?
Right.
Where do I put my money? How do I expose myself to some unanticipated upside, but have some conservatism? How do you address that question?
Yeah, look, energy right now, oil and gas is trading at a historical discount to the broad market. We've made good money in terms of cash flow terms, owning refineries and a variety of other midstream, upstream, and downstream assets. But we have to do so in investment vehicles that recognize that the multiples paid for those may never rise. So we have to do them in places where we can kind of own them and hold them for really good cash flow generation, but they're difficult to sell, and you really can't project the way you would with other growth industries that the multiples paid for those cash flows are ever going to go up. And I think that's a reasonable way to think about what the oil and gas sector is going to be going through over the next 10 to 15 years. Right now, the cash flow generation of the 30 to 40 largest U.S. oil and gas companies is off the charts, but the multiples people are willing to pay for that aren't there. There's one more thing I want to mention, because I started getting some emails yesterday about some of our economists and other people freaking out about where oil prices are. There's one more chart I regret that I didn't bring. The IEA has made a big deal of the fact that global fossil fuel consumption may be cresting right now. So a couple of points on that. Yes, their projection is that it's cresting globally, but it's projected to stay at that level for at least 10 to 15 years before declining. Point number two, even if fossil fuel consumption is cresting, fossil fuel investment has plummeted to 70% of where it was a few years ago. So ask any economics professor what's going to happen if demand is stable and the supply collapses. And people are going to say, oh my God, what's going on? Oil's over 100. And well, the writing is on the wall. It's very difficult to get oil and gas companies to make long-term capital commitments. So globally, capital spending on oil and gas projects has collapsed. And we're going to have an issue with price spikes over the next few years that'll come and go because there's not enough maintenance capital spending going on to support the level of consumption that's taking place.
So this IEA, we're going into deficit, but what maybe
like
one
the
last
federal
question.
government.
Yes, we are. We're representative of our world. The last question for you, because this IEA, Fatih Birol, he reaffirmed this forecast this week.
And these are forecasts.
These are forecasts. And then, OPEC had sort of a
OPEC responded by saying that it wasn't based in science.
What do you, and so this whole thing looks like, again, a feature of a debate that's not, everybody's not sitting at the table, sharing their numbers.
Well, look, the future consumption of fossil fuels can go a number of different directions, and so I think they shouldn't be sniping at each other. And what would make more sense is, here are the assumptions underlying what I think is going to happen, right? I've had these debates with the team at Princeton that does all their modeling. They're assuming that by 2030, like 80% of Class 8 semi-truck sales in the United States are EVs. I'm taking the under on that one. But that's all that's happening, right? That's all that's happening is that people have a very different set of underlying individual modeling points that they're disagreeing on. I don't think it's bad science. I just think it's a very different set of expectations.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for the Q&A, and thanks for all the great work you're doing to shed light on these things and make the discussion better.
All right, thanks for
Michael
having me.
Cembalest, thank you.